Imagine being inside the room when it happens, not watching from marble pillars, not reading some dusty fucking scroll 2,000 years later and shaking your head at how barbaric the ancients were. Inside, the air thick enough to chew, sweat and copper and something sweet rotting underneath, like lilies left in stagnant water too long, like a corpse that's been dressed in perfume to fool the guests. Your nostrils sting from frankincense burned in bronze braziers, the smoke mixing with what human bodies release when they're terrified past the point of bladder control. The oil lamps gutter, shadows crawl up walls painted with gods who aren't watching. Jupiter averts his marble eyes, Venus turns her painted face away. Everyone has looked away, everyone always does. You hear him before you see him, that laugh, not insane. Insane would be easier to stomach. Insane means the wires are crossed, the circuits fried, the machine broken in ways he couldn't control. This laugh, high, wet, almost a giggle, the sound a child might make if a child learned that other people's agony was the funniest thing in the universe, comes from a man who knows exactly what he's doing. A man who has built an entire philosophy, a theology, around why his pleasure matters more than your existence. But the laugh wasn't the worst sound in that room. Not even close. The worst sound was the silence between the screams. The moments when his victims realized begging didn't work, prayer didn't work, offering their daughters in their place didn't work, nothing worked, and something behind their eyes, some essential thing that made them human, just stopped. A door closing, a light going out. The room was full of people whose souls had already left their bodies before their hearts stopped beating. This is Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Caligula, Little Boots. And this is not the BBC version. This is not the sanitized documentary bullshit where historians use words like problematic and troubling while sipping tea in their studies. This is what actually happened when a 24-year-old man figured out that being emperor meant he could fuck anything with a pulse, torture anyone who objected, and call it divine will. Because he was a god now. No, more than a god. Gods had rules. Gods had myths they had to follow. Caligula had no rules, no myths, no boundaries, just the infinite, yawning hunger of a man who discovered that absolute power meant absolute license. And there was nothing, not the Senate, not the priests, not the entire fucking Roman army, that could stop him from doing whatever slithered into his imagination at 3 a.m. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals what was always waiting underneath. Picture this. You are 3 years old. You don't know what words like frontier or campaign or Germanic resistance mean. You don't understand politics or military strategy or why grown men are keep dying around you. All you know, all your developing brain can process, is the smell. Blood baking in sun-hot leather, wounds festering in the field hospital tent, the particular sweetness of a corpse that's been hanging on a cross for 3 days in August heat. And the sounds. Men screaming through severed windpipes, making noises that don't sound human because the machinery that produces human speech has been cut open. The way soldiers laugh, not nervous laughter, not gallows humor, genuine belly laughs, when they describe what they did to enemy women the night before. How she begged, how she cried, how her husband had to watch. Fucking hilarious, apparently. And these men, these killers, these rapists, these professional butchers who measure their worth in body counts and villages burned, they adore you. They've made you tiny military sandals. Little boots. Caligula, they call you, ruffling your hair with hands that hours ago were elbow deep in someone's abdominal cavity, pulling out organs and tossing them onto piles. This is your nursery. These are your lullabies. Stories about disembowelment instead of fairy tales. Demonstrations of how to slit a throat efficiently instead of learning the alphabet. What does that do to a child's brain? Don't give me the clinical answer. Sit with it. Feel it in your gut. Modern psychology has words for it, of course. Desensitization to violence. Trauma bonding. Normalization of antisocial behavior. Pretty clinical terms that don't capture what actually happens inside a kid who learns, before he can even read, that causing pain makes people like you. That the men who are kindest to him are also the men who describe, in loving detail over wine, how they gang-raped a chieftain's daughter until she stopped breathing. That violence isn't something you do because you have to. It's something you do because it feels good, because it's entertainment, because it's how you show the world you're strong. Caligula didn't just witness violence. He was marinated in it, raised by it, loved by it. Your father dies when you're 6. Poisoned, probably. Germanicus, Rome's golden general, beloved by the legions, the only man holding the empire's moral center together, dies mysteriously in Syria, clutching his throat, accusing his enemies with his last breath. 6-year-old Caligula watches his mother, Agrippina the Elder, transform. She doesn't cry, not where anyone can see. She hardens. She calcifies into something paranoid and vengeful, convinced. Correctly, it turns out, that enemies lurk behind every marble pillar, that her children are targets, that the imperial court is a nest of vipers wearing human faces. So young Gaius, still wearing those little boots, still too young to understand why everyone suddenly seems afraid, learns lesson number 2 in the curriculum of monsters. Love is a weakness someone will eventually exploit. Trust is suicide with extra steps. The only people who survive are the ones who strike first, strike hardest, and never let anyone see what they actually feel. But the education wasn't finished. The real masterclass was still coming. By the time you're a teenager, you've been shipped off to Capri. Uncle Tiberius's pleasure island. Stop imagining white marble and beautiful coastlines. Stop imagining Roman luxury and gentle sea breezes. Capri in 31 AD was a rape factory disguised as a vacation home, a human abattoir where Tiberius, old and paranoid and bored with conventional cruelty, had retreated to explore the outer edges of what human bodies could endure and human minds could survive. Tiberius had what he called his little fishes. Pisciculi in Latin, such a cute fucking name, young boys and girls, some as young as 7 or 8, trained to perform sexual acts that would make you vomit if I described them fully. Specialists were imported from across the empire to teach techniques that combined pleasure with pain, submission with psychological destruction. Rooms were designed for specific acts, specific tortures, specific violations that required custom furniture, custom restraints, custom implements that archaeologists still argue about because they can't believe what they're seeing in the ruins. Visitors arrived at Capri as dignified Roman nobles, senators, generals, priests, and left with something broken behind their eyes that never healed. They'd been forced to participate, forced to watch, forced to do things that made them complicit, and complicity is a wound that never closes. And teenage Caligula watched all of it. Not just watched, studied, took mental notes, catalogued every technique of psychological manipulation, every method of inspiring terror, every way that power could be weaponized for sexual gratification. This wasn't a child being traumatized anymore. This was a graduate student doing fieldwork. He learned how Tiberius used shame as a scalpel, how he made victims feel responsible for their own degradation, how the anticipation of horror was often more effective than the horror itself. Caligula wasn't born a monster. He earned a doctorate in it, summa cum laude, from the most sadistic university that ever existed. This is the part nobody wants to sit with, the part that makes the comfortable mad emperor narrative fall apart. Caligula wasn't insane. He was educated, carefully, deliberately, by an empire that treated human beings as entertainment and called it civilization. By a system that gave the emperor absolute power, surrounded him with sycophants who would applaud anything, and then acted surprised when the result was a man who treated sexual violence like a fine art. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, possibly with Caligula's help, the sources are divided, but the timing was awfully convenient. The 24-year-old who took the throne wasn't a gibbering lunatic. He was a scholar of suffering, a connoisseur of cruelty, a man who'd spent his entire adolescence learning exactly how much pain a person could absorb before they stopped being a person. And he was finally in a position to apply that knowledge. Rome celebrated in the streets. Bonfires, sacrifices to the gods, weeks of games and feasts. The Senate wept with relief. Finally, they thought, a young emperor, a fresh start, a sane man after years of Tiberius's paranoid terror. They had no fucking idea what they'd just crowned. They just handed absolute power to a man whose entire sexual education had taken place in a torture chamber. First few months, he played it beautifully, a masterclass in manipulation. The mask of charm that Suetonius describes, so perfect, so seamless, that even Tiberius never suspected the darkness behind it, was deployed at full power. Political prisoners released from the dungeons where they'd been rotting for years. Generous bonuses paid to the Praetorian Guard, buying their loyalty with gold before they had time to think about whether this new emperor deserved it. Spectacular games hosted at the Circus Maximus, more lavish than anything Rome had seen in decades. Public works announced, taxes temporarily reduced. The people were ecstatic. The Senate wrote speeches comparing him to Augustus, to the gods themselves, to the glorious future of the empire made flesh stop. Rewind, look closer, watch the servants, the palace staff noticed things, requests that didn't make sense, rooms being prepared at strange hours, furnished with items that had no obvious purpose. Women summoned to the imperial chambers and returning different. Not visibly injured, Caligula was too smart for obvious damage, but diminished, reduced, like something had been scooped out of them with a spoon while they were in there. Their eyes wouldn't focus. Their hands trembled when they thought no one was watching. They startled at sudden movements and couldn't explain why. Caligula wasn't just raping them. That would have been too simple, too artless, too quick. He was conducting experiments. See, most rapists are stupid. Brute force, quick satisfaction, leave. Animal impulse dressed in human skin. Caligula approached sexual violence the way a sculptor approaches marble. Every encounter was a study, a data point, a test of a hypothesis he'd been developing since those nights on Capri, watching Tiberius's specialists work. How much humiliation before the spirit breaks completely? Can a wife be made to participate in her own degradation willingly, not under direct threat, but because she's been psychologically conditioned to believe resistance is pointless? What happens when you force a father to not just watch what you're doing to his daughter, but to approve it verbally, on record, in front of witnesses? Does something in his brain snap, or does it bend, and which outcome is more satisfying to observe? These weren't random acts of lust. They were carefully calibrated psychological vivisections, and Caligula, ever the scholar, ever the scientist of suffering, documented everything. Palace scribes were ordered to record details that made them physically ill. Victim responses were catalogued, outcomes were compared, methods were refined. He didn't want their bodies, he wanted the moment their souls gave up. The wives and daughters of Rome's elite became his primary targets. Not because they were beautiful, some were, some weren't. He genuinely didn't seem to care either way. He targeted them because they represented something. Honor, family continuity, Roman virtue, social stability. Every time he publicly announced his intention to bed a senator's wife, not privately, not discreetly, but at a banquet, in front of everyone, describing in explicit detail what he intended to do, while the husband was forced to smile and nod approval. He was sending a message that echoed through every noble house in the empire. Nothing you have belongs to you. Nothing you love is safe. Your honor is a fiction I can dissolve with a single sentence. I own everything, including you, including her, including whatever you thought was sacred. But the public humiliation was foreplay. The real horror happened in private. Survivors, and there were fewer than you'd hope, described encounters with the emperor that felt less like sexual assault and more like psychological autopsy. He would study their faces during degradation. He would pause to ask questions. How does that feel? Describe it. No, more detail. What are you thinking right now? What do you think your husband would think if he could see you? Would he still love you? Would you still want him to? He wasn't just breaking them. He was understanding exactly how the breaking worked. Building a comprehensive taxonomy of human psychological collapse, organized by personality type, social background, and family structure, the palace became a laboratory, and every victim was both experiment and experimental data. But the sisters, God, the sisters. This is where it gets worse. Caligula had 3. Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla. 3 women whose only crime, their only crime in the entire universe, was sharing blood with a man who'd learned that the ultimate taboo wasn't just sexually gratifying. It was the ultimate expression of ownership. You can't get more mine than someone who came from the same womb, who shares your ancestors, who trusted you when you were children playing together before they understood what you were becoming. Caligula didn't just sleep with his sisters. That's the sanitized version that lets you sleep at night. What he actually did was redesign the Imperial palace so their quarters interconnected. No walls, no doors, no boundaries, no privacy. He'd summon all 3 at once and make them witness what he did to each of them. The psychological architecture of it was as important as the physical act, maybe more important. Sit there. Watch what I do to her. Know that you're next. Know that she's watching you too. Know that there is no escape, no sanctuary, no moment when you are not available to me. Drusilla was his favorite. The ancient sources describe her as beautiful. Golden hair, luminous eyes, the kind of face that launched sculptures. But that's almost irrelevant to understanding what happened between them. What mattered was that she loved him, had loved him since childhood, in whatever complicated, damaged way you can love a brother who's been systematically destroying your boundaries since you were old enough to understand what boundaries were. And Caligula weaponized that love, turned it into a tool of torture, made her complicit in her own destruction by convincing her that their relationship was special, sacred, ordained by gods who apparently approved of incestuous psychodrama. He created elaborate ceremonies where Drusilla was simultaneously worshipped as a living goddess and degraded as personal property. He'd dress her in divine regalia, golden crowns, purple robes, the trappings of Juno herself, and then force her to perform sexual acts in front of courtiers who were required to maintain expressions of religious awe while watching their emperor rape his sister. The cognitive dissonance was the point. Divine and defiled, sacred and shattered, goddess and whore. He was studying how long a human mind could hold those contradictions before it fragmented into something that could no longer function in normal for society. When Drusilla died in 38 AD, it was almost a mercy. Almost, the sources don't agree on cause of death. Some say fever. Some say the cumulative physical toll of years of systematic abuse. Some whisper that she found a way to end it herself. What the sources do agree on is Caligula's reaction. He didn't grieve like a brother who'd lost a sister. He didn't even grieve like a lover who'd lost a partner. He grieved like an artist who'd lost his masterpiece. Years of careful conditioning, thousands of hours of psychological sculpting, his primary subject, his perfect experiment, gone. Irreplaceable, he declared her a goddess, panthea, universal divinity, and made it a capital offense to show insufficient sorrow. Senators had to prostrate themselves before her statues. Temples were erected, priests were appointed, and behind the scenes, Caligula began hunting for replacements. Women who looked like Drusilla, women who could be forced to become Drusilla, dressing in her clothes, wearing her perfume, responding to her name, participating in increasingly elaborate psychodramas that blended necrophilic obsession with sexual torture. His surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, inherited her role in his affections, but now it was worse than before. Now he made them participate in memorial rituals for their dead sister that were essentially sexual reenactments. Grief weaponized as foreplay. Mourning transformed into an opportunity for new violations. The dead don't rest when the living refuse to let them go. Agrippina learned to survive differently than Drusilla had. She was smarter than her sister, colder, more calculating. She learned to manipulate her brother's obsession, to use his twisted desires as leverage for political influence, all while internally cataloguing every outrage and waiting for the moment when she could strike back. She would later teach her son, the future Emperor Nero, everything she'd learned about power, manipulation, and the strategic use of sexuality. The cycle of abuse didn't end with Caligula. It echoed through generations, each wave of trauma creating new monsters. The Roman Senate found itself in an impossible position. They were required to honor the imperial sisters as goddesses, while privately knowing they were victims of systematic incestuous abuse. Senators had to participate in religious ceremonies, celebrating Drusilla's divinity, while understanding that she'd been psychologically destroyed by the man they were also required to worship as a living god. The moral and theological corruption of Roman institutions had begun in earnest. Public entertainment, Romans loved their games. Gladiators fighting to the death, exotic beasts from the corners of the empire tearing condemned criminals apart. Mythological reenactments where the actor playing Orpheus got torn apart by real bears for the audience's amusement. Standard stuff for an empire built on conquest, slavery, and the conviction that some people existed solely to suffer for the entertainment of others. Caligula looked at this tradition and saw potential, untapped potential. The games changed under his reign, not gradually, like some organic evolution of entertainment trends, suddenly, violently. One month you're watching professional fighters demonstrate martial skill with honor and discipline. The next month, captured enemy leaders' wives and daughters are being dragged into the arena for intermission entertainment that makes corpses of women while their husbands and fathers are chained in the front rows, forced to watch. And Caligula wasn't watching the victims. He was studying the families. He'd positioned mirrors and polished bronze surfaces throughout the arena, specifically to observe the faces of fathers watching their daughters' degradation. He studied which reactions interested him most: the ones who wept openly, the ones who went dead behind the eyes, the ones who tried to look away and had their heads wrenched forward by guards. Each response was catalogued mentally. Each family's breaking point was noted for future reference. This was scientific, methodical. The most evil thing you can imagine executed, with the precision of a natural philosopher documenting a new species of plant. The games evolved. Caligula began randomly selecting audience members during performances to participate in impromptu sexual exhibitions. A gesture from the Imperial box, lazy, almost casual, like swatting a fly, and suddenly a respectable Roman matron is being stripped in front of her children, her neighbors, her entire social circle. No warning, no reason given, no crime committed, just the emperor's whim, which was the only law that mattered anymore. Beneath the arena, in chambers that archaeologists are still excavating, Caligula built facilities specifically designed for sexual torture. Not dungeons, those were too crude. Laboratories, staffed by specialists recruited from across the empire, men and women, with particular talents for combining physical pain with psychological destruction. Victims would be processed through these rooms for hours or days, before being released back to their families. Not dead, that would have been too merciful, but transformed. Walking psychological contagions. Their trauma would infect everyone who loved them. Their damage would ripple outward through the social fabric like cracks in ice. That was the point. That was always the point. He wasn't just destroying individuals. He was using sexual violence as a strategic weapon to dismantle the basic structures of Roman civilization: marriage, family, honor, parental protection, religious sanctity. Everything that held society together, he was systematically corrupting. And the most horrifying part? The crowds kept coming, week after week. The games got worse. The sexual violence became more explicit, more creative, more sadistic. And the Roman people, these civilized, sophisticated, empire-building Romans, adapted. What initially shocked them into silence eventually became normalized entertainment. The emperor had successfully corrupted the moral sensibilities of an entire civilization, training hundreds of thousands of people to find pleasure in systematic sexual torture. The infection was spreading. 40 AD, the Imperial brothel. I use that word deliberately because harem sounds too romantic, too Arabian Nights, too exotic pleasure palace. This wasn't pleasure. This was industrial-scale psychological destruction housed in beautiful architecture. Caligula's agents had spent 2 years scouring the empire for women. Not just beautiful women, though beauty helped, but strategically chosen women. A general's beloved daughter, a senator's new young wife, the cherished sister of a provincial governor with a large army. Each selection was calculated to cause maximum structural damage to Roman power networks. Each woman's degradation was designed to send a message not just to her family, but to her entire social class. The facility was designed with the same attention to detail Caligula brought to everything. Observation rooms where he could watch without being seen. Chambers designed for multiple occupants, where women could be forced to participate in each other's humiliation. Quarters for the women's family members, mothers, fathers, husbands, who would be brought in periodically to witness what was being done to their loved ones, ensuring that the trauma spread outward like a virus through every relationship the victim had ever formed. The women themselves lived in luxury: silk sheets, fine food prepared by imperial chefs, beautiful gardens where they could walk during designated hours, and every day, sometimes multiple times a day, Caligula or his hand-picked proxies would continue the psychological dismantling. Degradation followed by affection, torture followed by gifts. The classic abuse cycle, the same pattern that domestic abusers use today, but scaled to imperial proportions and studied with clinical precision. He kept records, detailed, meticulous, cross-referenced records. After his assassination, when investigators finally accessed the palace archives, they found documentation that made battle-hardened Praetorian guards vomit on the marble floors. Victim profiles with family histories and psychological assessments. Notes on which techniques were most effective for different personality types. Stubborn subjects respond better to X than Y, written in Caligula's own elegant handwriting. Timelines tracking exactly how long it took to break a resistant subject versus a compliant one. Comparison charts, progress reports, recommendations for future refinement. This was organized research. Human beings as experimental subjects. Sexual torture as data collection. The most evil thing you can possibly imagine, bureaucratized. The staffing requirements for this facility were enormous. Hundreds of guards, servants, administrators, scribes, physicians, all gradually normalized to increasingly horrific acts. Caligula understood something that modern totalitarian regimes have also figured out. Complicity is a more effective control mechanism than fear. Make someone participate in evil, even in a small way, and they'll spend the rest of their lives justifying that participation rather than confronting what they've become. The guards who delivered women to the emperor's chambers, the servants who cleaned up afterward, the scribes who documented everything, all of them trapped, all of them corrupted, all of them complicit. The greatest prison is the one you help build around yourself. Women who graduated from the Imperial facility. The ones who survived, the ones he eventually tired of, were released back to their families. But they weren't the same women who'd been taken. They'd been psychologically restructured from the inside out, trained to normalize sexual violence, trained to expect degradation as the natural state of existence, trained to spread their damage through their families and communities, like a disease looking for new hosts. Marriages shattered within months of a wife's return. Children grew up with mothers who flinched at sudden movements and cried without reason and couldn't explain why they sometimes couldn't bear to be touched. The damage was generational. Caligula was reaching forward through time to poison the future as well as the present. The theological corruption was perhaps the most insidious element. Caligula forced Rome's priests to sanctify his sexual practices as divine commandments, declare that the emperor's pleasure was the will of the gods, create rituals and ceremonies that wrapped systematic rape in the language of religious devotion. This wasn't just about legitimizing his crimes. It was about corrupting the very spiritual foundations of Roman civilization, so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't be able to separate the sacred from the sadistic. By the end of 40 AD, less than 4 years into his reign, Caligula had successfully corrupted Rome's military command structure, its priestly colleges, its senatorial aristocracy, and its basic family units. Sexual violence had become not just imperial policy but imperial theology. The center was not holding, things were falling apart. And the worst part? It was all going exactly according to his plan. But here's what Caligula didn't calculate. Here's the variable he missed in all his careful documentation. The thing his psychological studies failed to account for. The flaw in his grand experiment. Trauma, when it spreads widely enough, doesn't just destroy. It also connects. Victims find each other. They recognize something in each other's eyes. A particular quality of damage, a specific flavor of silence. The way someone's hands tremble when they think no one is watching. The way someone's voice catches on certain words. Caligula had created so many victims, had scattered so many walking wounded throughout Roman society, that they inevitably started finding each other. And when enough traumatized people find each other, when they start sharing their stories in whispered conversations in shadowed corners, something predictable happens. Shared suffering transforms. It ferments. It becomes something else entirely. Rage. By January of 41 AD, the survivors of Caligula's experiments had been finding each other for months. Nervous conversations in the back rooms of temples. Names exchanged in the shadows of the forum. Horror stories compared, verified, catalogued. And slowly, almost organically, a plan forming. Not a political conspiracy in the traditional sense. This wasn't about policy or taxes or administrative reform. This was vengeance. Pure, distilled and patient, Cassius Caria, the Praetorian Guard officer who led the assassination, wasn't motivated by Republican idealism or personal ambition. He'd been forced, personally, directly, repeatedly, to participate in Caligula's sexual tortures. The emperor found it amusing to make a respected military officer, a man who'd served Rome honorably for decades, serve as his pimp and assistant. Caligula had held women down, had delivered victims to the imperial chambers, had stood guard outside while unspeakable things happened on the other side of the door, and he couldn't wash that off. Couldn't forget, couldn't forgive himself, could only seek the one form of absolution available to him: blood. When they finally killed him, they stabbed him 30 times. 30 separate wounds in that beautiful, young, god-emperor body. That's not an assassination. That's an exorcism. That's years of accumulated horror, being expelled through sharpened steel. One thrust for each category of crime, each wound representing thousands of victims who could never strike back themselves. They didn't stop when he died. That's the detail the history books sometimes gloss over. They kept stabbing, kept screaming. Officers who'd maintained perfect composure throughout decades of military service wept openly as they mutilated his corpse. Grown men, hardened killers, Praetorian Guard veterans who'd seen everything, crying, screaming, stabbing a dead body until their arms gave out. This wasn't regime change. This wasn't a coup d'etat. This was a civilization vomiting out a poison that had almost killed it. His wife was found, her skull crushed against a wall. His infant daughter, yes, he had a daughter barely a year old, was ripped from her nurse's arms and her head smashed against the stones. The conspirators weren't taking chances. They were sterilizing the bloodline, making sure that nothing Caligula had touched, nothing that carried his genetic material, nothing that might grow up to repeat his crimes, would survive. Claudius, the stammering, limping uncle everyone had dismissed as an idiot, was found hiding behind a curtain in the chaos, terrified that he was next. Instead, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed him emperor on the spot. They needed someone. Anyone who wasn't Caligula. Claudius's first acts as emperor weren't political reforms. They were triage, medical care for the survivors he could find, financial compensation paid to families who'd been destroyed, the systematic destruction of Caligula's archives, not to protect his predecessor's reputation, as some historians have claimed, but because the documentation was so horrifying that its mere existence threatened the legitimacy of the imperial system. Some truths are too dangerous to preserve. Knowing what had been done in such detail would have made it impossible for anyone to ever trust imperial authority again. So the records were burned, the facilities were dismantled, the surviving victims were paid for their silence, and the official narrative began to take shape. Caligula was insanus, a madman, an aberration, a freak of nature that emerged from nowhere and disappeared just as suddenly, not a predictable product of Roman institutions, not the logical endpoint of absolute power with zero accountability. Just crazy. Could have happened to anyone. Nothing systemic to see here. Move along. But the damage couldn't be erased as easily as the records. Caligula's reign of sexual terror had corrupted fundamental Roman institutions in ways that persisted for generations. The military had learned that loyalty to the emperor meant participation in atrocity. The priesthood had learned that divine will was whatever the man in purple said it was. The Senate had learned that honor was a fiction that could be dissolved at any moment by imperial whim. And Roman families had learned that their loved ones could be taken, degraded, and returned damaged, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, they could do about it. The psychological trauma he inflicted rippled through generations. His niece Agrippina, who'd survived his abuse by learning to manipulate him, went on to marry Claudius and then poison him, installing her son Nero on the throne. Nero, who'd grown up watching his mother use sex and violence as political tools, would eventually have her murdered and go on to create his own reign of sexual terror that made Caligula's look almost restrained. The cycle continued. The trauma reproduced itself. The poison stayed in the bloodstream of the empire for centuries. Modern psychology helps us understand what ancient historians could only describe. How Caligula's childhood exposure to extreme violence, his adolescent education in Tiberius's torture chambers, and his adult acquisition of absolute power combined to create a perfect storm of sexual sadism. How the normalization of abuse in his developmental years made cruelty not just possible but inevitable. How systems that place individuals beyond accountability create conditions where sadism can evolve into systematic torture without a meaningful resistance. Civilizations don't die, they commit suicide slowly, one unpunished crime at a time. I want you to sit with something uncomfortable, not academic, not historical, personal. The ruins of the Circus Maximus are still there. You can visit them. Stand on the same ground where Roman citizens cheered while women were being systematically destroyed for their entertainment. The stones remember what happened. The dust remembers. But do we? How many Caligulas are operating right now? Not in palaces, we don't have palaces anymore, not officially. But in boardrooms, in institutions, in religious organizations, in political parties, in entertainment industries. Positions of absolute power where accountability is a joke, and victims are paid for their silence, with checks that come with non-disclosure agreements attached. How many little boys are being taught right now that causing pain is strength, that consent is optional if you have enough leverage, that other people's bodies exist for their gratification? How many teenagers are learning right now that the powerful are exempt from the rules that govern everyone else? The clothing changes. Togas become business suits, palaces become penthouse apartments, chariots become private jets. But the psychology? The systematic destruction of human dignity for personal gratification? The institutional complicity that enables it, covers it up, protects the perpetrator and blames the victim. The way entire communities learn to look away, to normalize what should horrify them, to participate in evil by doing nothing. That never changes. That's the eternal nightmare Caligula represents. Not some historical aberration, safely contained in the distant past, but a permanent human potential that activates whenever power is separated from consequence, whenever someone is told they're beyond judgment, whenever the people around them decide that preserving the institution is more important than protecting the vulnerable. The conspiracy that ended Caligula proves something that should give you hope, even through the horror. Even the most sophisticated systems of terror eventually create their own resistance. Human dignity, however suppressed, however violated, however systematically destroyed, finds ways to strike back. The victims who survived, the families who remembered, the soldier who couldn't wash the blood off his hands, they eventually found each other in the dark. They shared their stories, they made a plan, and they lit a fire that burned the monster down. But the fire only works if people are willing to light it, if victims are listened to, if institutions are held accountable. If the comfortable lie, "he's just crazy, it's not systemic, it couldn't happen here," is rejected in favor of the uncomfortable truth. Monsters are made, not born, and the same systems that created Caligula are still operating today, in different clothes, with different language, pursuing the same ancient evil. The monster isn't the anomaly. The monster is what happens when power forgets it has limits. If this made your skin crawl, good. It should. That crawling sensation is your moral immune system still functioning, still recognizing evil for what it is. Don't numb it. Don't suppress it. Don't let anyone tell you it's just history, and therefore irrelevant. Suskort. I'll be here, digging through the worst things human beings have ever done to each other. Not because I enjoy it, because someone has to remember what the powerful are counting on you to forget. Next time, Caligula's nephew Nero, the boy who watched his mother, survived by manipulation, and learned lessons that would make his uncle's crimes look like rehearsals. What Nero built on Caligula's foundation will make you question everything you believe about human nature. Until then, stay awake, stay uncomfortable, and never ever let anyone convince you that absolute power is safe in anyone's hands.